Hello, dear listener, and welcome to another episode of the Unlock Moment podcast. These days, I'm working with more and more leaders in different countries, cultures, and contexts who share one thing in common. They've reached a stage in their careers where they've built a lot of stuff, the basic skills and experience required to do the job well. A track record of achievement and impact, the confidence and competence to show up at work and be generally successful. In some ways, all that stuff gives you a freedom to choose who you are and what impact you want to have as a leader. But these people are also very often completely overwhelmed and feel stuck, running on the hamster wheel. No time for the big thinking on questions like, what makes you happy and fulfilled? Where are you truly at your best? Who really are you as a leader? What is your leadership brand? And how do you get your ideas heard? Well, today I'm absolutely privileged to be welcoming a world-leading speaker, business thinker, coach, and best-selling author to the podcast. Dorie helps individuals and companies get their best ideas heard in a crowded, noisy world. She's been named 3 times as one of the top 50 business thinkers by Thinkers 50 and was honored as the #1 communication coach in the world at the Marshall Goldsmith Coaching Awards. She teaches for Columbia Business School in New York and is the author of The Long Game, Entrepreneurial You, Reinventing You, and Stand Out. She has well over 300,000 followers on LinkedIn. A former presidential campaign spokeswoman, Dorie has been described by the New York Times as an expert in self-reinvention and helping others make changes in their lives. She's a frequent contributor to the Harvard Business Review and consults and speaks for clients such as Google, Yale University, and the World Bank. She's a graduate of Harvard Divinity School, a producer of a multiple Grammy-winning jazz album, and a Broadway investor, truly multifaceted. I think we're in a year where reinvention is a hot topic for both emerging and established leaders. I can't wait to hear Dorie's take and, of course, to explore the unlock moments that shaped her as the person she is today. Dorie Clark, it's my huge pleasure to welcome you to the Unlock Moment.
Gary, thank you. It's great to be here with you.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time. So today you're known for many things, and in particular for helping people to redefine themselves and take control of the path ahead. But if we really wanted to understand the person you are today, where would we need to start in your story?
Well, if we're going back to the earliest primordial ooze, I would say that a crucial thing was growing up in a very small town. I grew up in a golf resort town in North Carolina, which has indeed grown substantially over the decades. But when I was living there, it was tiny. It was just a few thousand people. And so a lot of things that even were normal at the time, like cable television or, food that wasn't pizza or things like that, were just utterly inaccessible. It was such a small place in a small world, and there was no internet. So for me, television and just like watching, really retrospectively bad primetime television was the only way that I could sort of have a window on the outside world. And so I just grew up very, very highly motivated to want to get out of the town and go do something, go make something in my life.
And when you think back, what age were you when you started to have that kind of desire to get out and move on and expand?
Oh, I mean, from my earliest memories, I mean, I just really couldn't believe my parents had chosen to live there. I mean, it's a nice place if you like golf, but if you are not a massive golf aficionado, like why on earth? It just seemed like a truly preposterous choice, and one that I wanted to correct as soon as I humanly could. Mm-hmm. So I left town at 14.
Oh, wow.
I went to college early because I really was looking for ways. I mean, I had a plan A, a plan B, and a plan C so that I could leave.
So college at 14, what were you doing?
Yes. I'm sorry?
What were you doing at college at 14? What did you go in to do?
Well, I ended up as a philosophy major. But yeah, there was a a program, a sort of special early entrance program that they had at the time at a school in Virginia called Mary Baldwin College, now university, and it allowed you to go pretty early. I mean, there were even some people as young as 12 there.
Wow.
But I went at 14 and was able to kind of blitz through and finished up when I was 18. I had transferred to a school in Massachusetts called Smith College, which is one of the famed Seven Sisters colleges, and it was great. It was a wonderful thing for me to be able to actually operationalize my plan, because it would have been, as you just get older as a teenager and you develop more of a desire for autonomy and legitimately more ability to be autonomous, it just gets exponentially more frustrating when that opportunity is stifled. So I was really glad I was able to do that.
And so at 14, were you alongside other 14-year-olds? Were you alongside older children, teenagers, young adults in that space?
It was a small program. I was not the only person, but there were about 50 people who were in the early entrance program. So I had peers, I had a cohort, but the majority of people at the university were traditional age students.
It's really interesting. You make me think of a conversation I had very early on in doing the Unlocked Moment podcast with Amanda Britton, who now is the CEO of an organization in the UK called Rambert School, which is like Juilliard in New York. It's a contemporary dance sort of higher education academy. And I talked to her about her story. I've known her a long time, but we hadn't talked about this. And she said, I left home at 12 to pursue my dance career. And there was something about that sense of independent spirit that I hear in you too. There wasn't a moment in your teenage years where you started to have ideas of moving on and moving out and expanding. You said it was from your very earliest memories that you felt that way. So what does that tell us about who you are today, that's how you were at that young age?
Well, it always is a really interesting question of the sort of nature versus nurture. But I do think that from a very young age, I was highly motivated. It's hard for me to understand. I mean, I grasp intellectually that, there's many people out there who, they either have kids or they might say, reflecting back on themselves, like, I could have never done it when I was 14. I was just playing video games and eating Cheetos and, whatever. But it's hard for me to wrap my head around that because I really had a mission. I was very focused. I mean, when I look back, all the research says your prefrontal cortex is not fully developed until you're 26. So, I'm surely not making the best decisions possible in certain areas of my life, and I can appreciate that. But at least in terms of the broad brushstrokes, like I was on it. Like I was pretty mature and was able to make pretty good life choices by then. So I don't know if that's a thing you're just sort of, it came baked in, but I was not a slacker.
I love that. I had a mission. One of the questions that I get asked probably more than almost any other is, do I have to have some big life goal? And all the successful people know exactly what they're aiming for, and then they're just heading for that goal, and then they achieve it. And I'm not sure that I have that big life goal. When you say, I had this mission, how clear was your long-term aim at that time?
Oh, I mean, I think, to be clear, this is a good distinction, Gary, for sure. The precise contours of the mission were a little foggy. I would say what was very clear was the mission was like, get out of this town. That much was perfectly clear. But in terms of like, I'm going to make XYZ contribution. I mean, I still don't even know that. I think that by the time I'm dead, I will probably have pivoted or changed or done different things that I can't even predict now. So I think that there's a lot of an iterative process of sort of coming into the way that you're able to help others or make a contribution. I'm curious, what kind of a doctor were you? And what was it like from when you were 5? You're like, I want to be a doctor, or how did that transpire?
There's so many connections in our story here. So I like you went on some accelerated programs when I was growing up. I didn't have this sort of big vocational mission to become a doctor. I was probably, in the UK, you go to medical school at 18, straight from school. And I was probably 17 when I decided that was something I wanted to do. And I didn't really know why. And I went all the way through medical training. I did the MB PhD here in the UK. So I spent 8 years in medical school. And after 7, I figured out it wasn't what I wanted to do as a career. So, in retrospect, I've always wondered, did I make a bad decision at 18 to start on that journey that later I decided...
Did you ever end up practicing?
Never practiced. So it was the moment of going into practicing. I was like, is this really what I want to do? And of course, the benefit of being a bit older at that stage is you have more of an understanding of life. But actually, I think like you, I feel like I still back my decision to go into it because at the time... kind of made sense. It was not a terrible decision, but I didn't know myself well enough. And I didn't know what that career was really like. You only know kind of what you've seen in the movies, unless your parents are doctors or you know doctors closely, and mine were not. And I didn't know that. So
my dad actually was a doctor. And I can tell you one thing I knew for sure was I am not effing doing this. It just seemed like such a nightmare. Yeah. He was like on call a lot, and they did not have cell phones, of course, back then. And so in the middle of the night, like all the time, our phone would be ringing and they'd be like calling him with like some emergency. And because he was a psychiatrist, he treated a lot of drug and alcohol cases. And so the emergency was usually somebody doing some stupid thing. And it's like, like, that's just not cool. It just seemed ridiculous. So I everybody, they love to be all like, do you want to be a doctor like your daddy? And I'm just like, no. So I feel you, man. Yeah. I feel you.
And I think that's interesting because, of course, at that age, and often through people's careers too, when you think about, well, what am I going to be? What job or career or industry am I going to be in? And even what kind of leader am I going to become? It feels like a choice between options on a shelf. This kind of leader or that kind of leader, this job or that job, this industry, this location, whatever it is. I think that what I'm realizing now, and I'm late 40s now, and probably through podcasting and coaching, getting more in touch with myself actually than I ever have in my career, I realized that my sense of mission and my sense of purpose, which always felt, I think, as you described, kind of powerful, but not focused. I have made many career pivots in my time. And then recently I was talking to Michael Librant, the strengths coach who came on the podcast, and she said, I think you're curious about people, and I think there's something about conversations. Whatever you've done, it's connected through conversation. And so I'm finding these new lenses of ways to think about who you are and what you do that are not bounded by, is it a doctor? Is it a lawyer? Is it a teacher? Is it a bold leader? Is it a servant leader? Like different leadership models. It's more about who you uniquely are. That's what I've connected with. Do you feel like your understanding of yourself has evolved through your career as you've learned more in that kind of way?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. One memory that really stands out for me when I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do professionally, I actually had a decent understanding of maybe at least certain aspects of who I was or what I wanted to do. But the big problem for me was that the things I was interested in did not have a clear career path. Right. It wasn't like, go, you want to be a lawyer, go to law school. Like it just, that felt so simple and so nice and so easy and so clean. But the problem was the things that I thought seemed most interesting. I'm like, how do you do that? Like it just, it was extremely complex to try to figure it out and to reverse engineer it. So what I was most interested in at the time when I was, graduating from college, I somehow wanted to have a career that was a combination of Tony Robbins, the motivational speaker, and George Stephanopoulos, who was the communications director for Bill Clinton's presidential campaign, and then later an ABC News anchor in the U.S. So that's what I sort of wanted to merge, and the career services office at my college also, they asked a question, which was a decent question, which is, well, what are the things that you like to do? Like, make a list of the things you like to do, and then you can kind of plug and play and figure out, like, well, what jobs would allow you to do those things? And so the two things that I came up with as being like my most viable things were, I liked to read the newspaper and give people my opinion. I'm like, all right, what do I do with this? I don't know. This is hard.
Interesting. I was going to become a landscape architect if I followed the survey in my career's path. I have no idea. I have no idea today what it was that I said or did, or which boxes I ticked that it threw out landscape architect is the career for you.
Would that have been good if you had been funneled into that? Do you think you would have been a happy landscape architect?
I feel like right now, in the last couple of years, maybe for the first time, it's quite interesting, like trees and plants and the outdoors. We're about to move house to a place that's got a bit more outdoors than where we live at the moment. And now it feels, but I think it's just because I'm getting older. I don't know that it's such a career mission. But yeah, I have no idea. There's something, what I've discovered. So when I started this podcast talking about unlocked moments, it came from working with people in coaching, and sometimes they would tell me these stories of the breakthrough moments, and they would often happen not when we're in a conversation, not even when they're sitting down trying to figure out the path ahead, but in between times when they were doing something completely different, and suddenly something would become clear. And over now a couple of years of doing the podcast, I've started to see in many people, not all people, but many people, something that I felt was somehow powerful, but I didn't quite understand it. So I wanted to go explore more. And it's something to do with, there's a connection between where you choose to begin telling your story, which for you was something about living in you said a small place in a small world. And then something about a moment that comes to mind when you think about, in your life or career, a sort of remarkable moment of clarity, and you remember where you were, who you were with, what you were thinking in that moment when that happens. And then the connection to who you are today and why you do what you do. For you, this idea of an unlocked moment, and you think back through all the things that you've done over the years, is there something that comes to mind and you think, yeah, that was really knowing something I didn't know before that was quite pivotal, and I put myself back in that place? What comes up for you?
Yeah, I mean, for sure, there are a lot of candidates, I think, for everyone probably. But something that was a really legitimately unexpected insight that occurred to me a number of years ago was to your earlier question, I didn't really know what I wanted to do professionally. I mean, there were a lot of things that I was interested in. I remember when I was in high school, I was sort of making a list of like possible careers. And, what's cool actually is that I've done at least pieces of almost all of these things. I haven't quite gone, all in, but I thought it would be interesting to be a filmmaker, or it would be interesting to be a journalist, or it would be interesting to be a novelist, or it would be interesting to be a university professor. Like, those were the kinds of realm of activity that I wanted to do. And anyway, I ended up doing pieces of them. I mean, sometimes I was all in. I actually did become a full-time journalist early in my career, but then I got laid off and I had to find a new plan for myself. I have taught university classes or business school classes for many years now on a part-time basis, but I had never considered working for myself or sort of having an entrepreneurial career. And it was around 2005. And at the time I was running a nonprofit, this, small nonprofit doing bicycle advocacy work. And in all honesty, it was the most stressful job I ever had. I had some kind of pressure cooker jobs. I mean, I had the job in journalism. I had been a spokesperson on a presidential campaign in the U.S., which was very high pressure. Right. You're literally working 7 days a week. You do not take a break. You work every single day. And that was high pressure. But existentially, running this little nonprofit was the most stressful one because I was the executive director, because it was this scrappy little nonprofit. It's not like the board was responsible for fundraising. Like, they really weren't. Like, realistically, I had to do all the fundraising and figure it all out. And it just felt so monumental to kind of keep this thing going. And I remembered that at a certain point, I had this revelation that had not yet crossed my mind for some reason, which was, running a nonprofit is really the same thing as running a business. Like, it's literally the exact same thing. It's just, what are you doing with the revenues once they come in? And, it took me like a beat. And then I'm like, wait, that means I could run my own business. And I had never thought of that. That had never been a goal of mine. It hadn't seemed practical. It just hadn't been a thought. But I suddenly realized, like, all of the pressure of running this organization, being responsible for this, like, I could actually mitigate a lot of it by just being responsible for myself. And I knew that, like, it's hard to run a business, but I knew I was clever enough to at least figure out how to keep a roof over my head. So I thought, oh, wait, that might be the ticket. And so I had been developing the skills during running the nonprofit. And over the course of the next year, I worked even more assiduously to develop new skills. So there was an adult ed program in my city, where you could take little like weekend classes or things like that. And so I took all the weekend classes you could imagine. I did about business plan creation, about bookkeeping software, about presentation design software, all the things. And I really wanted to flesh out my skill set so that I would be ready for entrepreneurship. And so that really turned the tide. And, now rather unexpectedly, I have been self-employed for the past 18 years.
In that moment, what did you know about yourself that you didn't know before?
I think that I realized that I had been building skills that I didn't know that I had been building. Up to that point, I had jobs where you were sort of doing a specialized thing and having a specialized skill set. You're a reporter, okay, you know how to write stories. Or even if you're a communications director on a campaign, you can handle the press function well, and that's fairly multifaceted, but you can't win a campaign on press alone. But running this nonprofit, it was so tiny. You had to be, I will use a metaphor that I'm assuming now as I'm saying it, you're probably like, what? But in the US, we call it a utility infielder.
No idea.
It's a term from baseball. Yeah. And basically a utility infielder is somebody who can play all the positions, right, and you can sort of sub them in wherever they need to go. And that's what I had to be, because when your staff is that small, you're filling out the workers' comp papers, you're fixing the computer, you're, answering the telephone, you're doing the mailing, you're coming up with a strategy, you're meeting with the major donors, you're doing literally everything. And that kind of builds both a kind of cross-functional skill set and a confidence that if you are forced to get outside your wheelhouse, that you can figure it out, which I think is quite useful and rather necessary for entrepreneurship.
And I'm seeing the 14-year-old who left home. Actually, in that,
yeah.
The independent streak, the mission, because it is the skills, the ability to do it, but also the desire to do that and take it on. And as you said, know that I'm smart enough to figure out how to have a roof over my head, And that's not by accident that you've been running your own thing for 18 years, I presume. Is it? What is it about that world?
I like it. I like it a lot. And also, I've had a history of really bad bosses. Like all the I mean, this is what you're setting out to solve, Gary, and God bless you for it. But literally all the bosses I ever had when I worked in traditional jobs were sucky. They were sucky bosses. I had people who were, mean and dismissive, who didn't give enough feedback, or were kind of mean when they gave feedback, or they played favorites, or, like all these things that you pick up a Harvard Business Review compiled, compendium of essays, and you're like, oh, check, and it was just so much, I mean, they're fine people, but their pathologies leaked out and infected everyone around them. And I was just like, oh, this is ridiculous. And so I didn't want to deal with it. I didn't have the patience for it.
And what's really interesting then about your journey in independence in that way is that, again, a lot of people I think feel as though if they're going to go down that path, they need to define themselves. They need to create a clear and consistent personal brand. They need to do one thing and do it over a long period of time. And one day they're going to get known for it. And you haven't done that over 18 years. You remain a very multifaceted person. Tell me a bit about getting into Broadway and musical theatre.
So in 2016, I decided to set a goal for myself that I wanted to have a 10-year program to write a show that made it to Broadway. And where this came from was actually, it sort of came out of, I guess you could say was a negative experience, which is the prior year I had been traveling so much. I had been sort of running myself ragged on a book tour for my then book, Stand Out, which was recently republished in the UK as Unapologetically You. And I was just traveling so much. And so I decided that I was not really appreciating New York enough. That's where I was living at the time. And so I made a campaign that once a week, at least once a week, I would do what I called a uniquely New York activity to try to appreciate the city and spend more time at home. And so one of the things that I did was I went to a Broadway show, which I had, scarcely been doing. And I ended up seeing a show called Fun Home, which was very, inspiring to me. And I woke up the next morning and I just had this absolute certainty. I'm like, I need to do that. I need to learn how to write musical theater. So I said, all right, I was literally starting from zero. I did not in any way know how to write musical theater. And I said, well, 10 years, right? There's the famous saying that we overestimate what we can do in a day and we underestimate what we can do in a year or 10 years. And I thought 10 years should be sufficient. And so I've been working on it since then. I'm now on year 8, and I have multiple shows that are in various stages of completion and production. And one show in particular is having its first full production. It's having a production at a university, the Ohio Wesleyan University, next month. So it's, we're moving toward it. We're moving forward.
That's amazing. And, lots of people, we've talked about before that in our household, we have quite a connection with musical theatre. And of course, different people take different things away from musical theatre. That day, that show that made you come away and go, this is the moment that I want to start on this journey. What was it that you took away that took you from, I enjoy musical theatre, or I find this art form moving or impactful, to, I actually want to do this myself?
It's a good question. I think for me in particular, so Fun Home is frankly a fairly surprising story to be a Broadway musical.
Right.
It is adapted from a graphic novel by a woman named Alison Bechdel. And it is a graphic novel, autobiographical, recounting her experience coming out at college as gay, and also discovering that it turns out her dad was also gay and was closeted. And then he ends up killing himself. So it's like, oh, happy day, right? It was like, wow, who would make a musical out of that? But it was actually an amazing and really powerful show. But what I realized in seeing it was, interestingly enough, and I think this is part of the sort of power of representation. As you can imagine, I mean, there's not a lot of musicals about topics like that, but also there's not a lot of lesbian musicals at all in general. Like, that's it, basically. Right. And I mean, aside from some like maybe super minor off-Broadway things, but if we're talking about Broadway, like the canon basically begins and ends there. And in seeing that and sort of seeing, some echoes of my own experience, because I'm gay and came out in college, of course, as well, or actually a little before, but, same. I realized that it had actually never occurred to me that I had never seen that experience on stage. Right. Because, you sort of grow up and, you get acculturated into what's around you. And so when you're gay, or, I presume if you're like a racial minority or something like that, you just build the muscle that you see a thing on stage and then you sort of translate it in your head into like, oh, well, for me, this would be blah, blah, blah. Or you learn to see yourself in the thing that's on stage, but you have to do a little bit of creative imagining to get there. And to actually see something that I was like, oh no, this is actually a representation of something, was so different and so meaningful that I was just like, wow, I didn't even know to ask for this. Right. I didn't even know that this was like an option. And so, I think this is part of why it's so powerful, things like Lin-Manuel Miranda reimagining the founding fathers as people of color. And so it's creative and interesting. And, it's also a story, of course, like all stories that if it's well done, it has universal human elements that anyone can appreciate. But I thought that was really interesting. And it made me realize, I want to contribute more to that canon.
So with the work you're doing now, what's it for?
So I'm not, to be clear, I don't have a sort of didactic goal with it. The last thing I want to do is have, a musical with a message. Like, in the US, there was a thing in the 70s and 80s called an after-school special. And it was very iconic and ridiculous because, every week there would be a TV show that was like an issues-based TV show where they were like trying to reach the kids with entertainment in cutting edge fashion. So it would be like a special presentation about, so-and-so who went too far with her boyfriend and got pregnant. Or, the next week it would be like, and then Jimmy experimented with weed. And, like all the things that could happen. It's like meant to scare the shit out of teenagers about literally everything they could do wrong. And so I am not interested in writing after-school special musicals. We've got enough of that in our lives. But for me, what is fun is really being able to create something ideally that draws from my bank of knowledge or experiences, and just things that maybe haven't been shown before that could be of interest or, spark something different. So, I mean, just by way of example, I'm a big James Bond fan. And so the first show that I wrote, the one that is premiering at Ohio Wesleyan University, is a lesbian spy musical. I mean, it's not really about lesbianism per se, but it's an all-female cast. And our James Bond-like hero is, like James Bond, a kind of hard drinker, womanizer, who also saves the world. And I thought that would be a really fun thing to write, to be able to say, hey, here's another vision. Here's another way we can do it. I also have written a show called The Philosopher of Love, which is a show. It's not a gay show, although it does have some gay characters in it. But it is about a kind of lovelorn philosophy professor whose friend hosts a dinner party in his honor. And the price of admission, and this is drawn from Plato's Symposium. This was the theme of Plato's Symposium, so it's kind of a modern day retelling. The price of admission is that everyone who is at the dinner party needs to give a speech about the meaning of love and what it means to them. And so we have this dinner party with lots of fraught social dynamics that are happening at the dinner, and sort of working out, well, what does love in a contemporary context really mean? Things like that.
It's really interesting. And there's a thread through everything you're saying that I can hear, and I'm sure listeners can hear, that your personal brand, your mission is really strong and is really clear and is really strong in you, but not easily defined. And it's what you said at the beginning, where you said, I had this really clear vision, or this really clear mission, but it wasn't one that you'd write in a sentence and say, I want one day to be a doctor or a lawyer or whatever. And that's okay. And I hear that even when you're talking about musicals, you're saying, you're not there to land a certain message with the audience. You're not there to have a certain outcome. You're there to put interesting work out there and make people think. When you're working with people, or when you're writing books for people to help them figure out their reinvention, how does that play through this finding mission, finding clarity, finding direction, without necessarily having to write a sentence that defines everything that you do?
Yeah, I think that's a great observation, Gary. I think that certainly an initial part of it is encouraging people to have patience with themselves, because everybody always wants to have it all figured out. It's a very embarrassing liminal space to exist in, where it's like, well, I don't really know. And then you feel like you're looking like an idiot, and all your friends are judging you, and, oh, he's 47. Why doesn't he have it figured out? Or, whatever it is. And I think that we have to be willing to push past that, because you can arrive at a lot of false conclusions if you try to rush the process. So it's letting ourselves stay in a liminal space for a while, and also, it doesn't mean that you're jumping. That's not good either. What I actually counsel is stay a little longer in the space that you're in, and experiment and test and play around on the side, and then jump when you actually have proof of concept and feel more secure about it.
Such good advice. And of course, you wrote a book on exactly this topic called The Long Game, how to be a long-term thinker in a short-term world. Tell me a bit about where you were when you knew that was the book you needed to write. What was going on for you at that sort of moment of concept?
So I started ideating around the book in 2018 or 2019. So it was kind of a pre-pandemic era. And many of the same themes stayed relevant, in some cases became even more relevant during the pandemic. But what I kept noticing, and sort of the trigger for me around this, was I would talk to friends and talk to colleagues, and you'd ask the sort of connection question, like, hey, how's it going, Gary? And almost invariably people would say some variation of, oh, really good, really good. I just wish I weren't so busy, or I wish I just had a moment to breathe, or something like that. And, I wish I had a moment to think. And it seemed like people were just being pushed to the brink. And the really ironic part was that a lot of them were self-employed, so they were pushing themselves to the brink. It's like, what is going on here? And I realized that all of the frenzy, first of all, we have to acknowledge at a certain point that we are choosing it for ourselves. I mean, there are times, of course, that we are forced into it, But if it keeps being a pattern structurally all the time, we are responsible for that. So we are choosing that for certain reasons. And so I wanted to understand what was going on there. What were we trying to cover up, essentially? What void were we trying to fill? And almost all of us claim that long-term thinking, strategic thinking is a value that we respect. And so why do we keep not doing the thing that we say that we want to do? That was what I wanted to explore.
And the very first step in that process is almost the only important one. Like when I was reading, I was struck by, this is the create space bit. And I talk to a lot of people about exactly that same thing, where they go, I could kind of figure out the other steps if only I had time. What do you say to people who are struggling to just find that time to even get started on the journey?
Yeah, that is a crucial part, because I think sometimes we erect straw men. We kind of imagine like, I need time, and therefore I need to take 6 months off, or therefore I need to have a meditation retreat for 10 days, or, I need to go to India, whatever it is. We sort of concoct this, I need space, and so therefore. And the truth is, strategic thinking does take time. That is true, but it doesn't take that much time. It's not like it takes an exponential multiple of the time that you're already spending on short-term thinking. It's just you need a little bit of distance. And in all honesty, an hour or two a week can do that. And so nobody is going to solve the problem for you. This is the first thing we have to recognize. It is all, and I want to bold this, it is always in other people's best interest for you to be immediately responsive to their needs and never have time for strategic thinking. Because, I love it if Gary answers my question on email 30 seconds later. Yay, that's nice. Good job, Gary. You've made my life easier. But you haven't necessarily made your life easier, because you have been making the choice implicitly to prioritize other people's needs rather than what is strategically relevant for you. And so you actually have to be a little bit of a hard ass about certain elements so that you can claw back that hour or two per week. And there is some low-hanging fruit. I mean, in my book, The Long Game, I share some strategies. I mean, one of them is a really basic one. It's one I had to learn the hard way, where sometimes people will say, they'll send a note and they'll be like, "Hey, Dorie, I need a half an hour of your time. I've got something I've got to talk to you about. When are you free?" And I used to assume that this meant that it's really important. They wouldn't be asking for, time and sort of ominously not saying what it's about, unless it was this big thing. And what I came to realize is how you think about it is not necessarily how other people think about it. Hey, Dorie, I need a half an hour of your time could mean I need to sell you some insurance. It could mean, hey, I need to ask you for a favor that's a really awkward and inappropriate favor, and I don't want to write it down. It can mean it could mean, hey, I want to ask you advice about a thing that I think you know about, but actually I didn't do my research, so you don't know anything about it. There's a million reasons why I shouldn't take this call. I mean, maybe I should, I don't know. But what I've learned is I take an extra step and I say, hey, Gary, great. I'd love to be helpful. What do you want to talk about? I will never get on the phone with anyone unless they tell me what they want to talk about. Right. So that's one very simple life hack that saves me a lot of grief.
I'm working with a group of people at the moment where it's not easy if you're the senior leader, but it's sometimes easier because you have more control, not necessarily 100% control, but more control over your diary. You might have more financial freedom to be able to consider potentially, taking a break, going to a yoga retreat or something like that. But I don't think this is the reserve of the privileged. What about somebody who might be in a junior role or a service role where they don't have a huge amount of control of their time? They don't have much financial freedom at all. How can they find more time?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's true that the lower you are on an organizational hierarchy, the more you do, to a certain extent, have to be at people's beck and call. I mean, one answer certainly is that you could attempt as best you can to be an organizational champion and see if you can make change in the organization. I mean, there's been a great deal of success, honestly, in different companies trying to have no meeting Mondays or things like that. And you could gather some case studies and bring it to your boss and say, hey, could we try this? It's often quite powerful, especially if something feels risky. To be able to posit it as an experiment. Hey, could we do a 1-month pilot where we try this and then we analyze it and we see how it was and see if people think it's productive or, what have you. And that benefits you, but it also benefits everyone organizationally. So that's certainly one key piece of it. But I think also when we think about, making space for these things, again, some of these are situations that we kind of bring on ourselves, right? I mean, there's very interesting research that I cite in The Long Game by Sylvia Bellezza and her colleagues at Columbia University. And it talks about how certainly in the United States, but in many Western cultures, there is essentially a social status that gets accorded to people who are busy or seen to be busy. And so we begin to get addicted to that social status. So we are making these upstream choices to fill every moment because it makes us feel valued. It makes us feel special. It makes us feel sought out. And so we need to kind of get over ourselves a little bit because we are, in fact, doing this to ourselves.
I'd love before we finish to talk a little bit about personal branding because it's so much the zeitgeist at the moment. People are thinking about personal branding for speakers or coaches or consultants or some experts. But actually, there's a lot of people who are not in those kind of roles. It might be within an organization. There might be an emerging or established leader, and they're thinking about, do I have to build a personal brand? What do people need to hear about how much they need to be thinking about personal branding when they're not necessarily building an independent business under their own name?
Yeah, I mean, of course, the crucial point here is that everybody already has a personal brand. It's really just a synonym for your reputation. And so the question is less, do I have to build a personal brand? It's more, do I want to take control of what my personal brand already is, or do I just want to let it happen? And I think it actually is legitimately important. I mean, it's crystal clear for someone who's self-employed because it is directly tied to your paycheck. If more people know you and respect you, then more people will probably hire you. But it is also true, albeit maybe in a slightly less obvious way, for people who work inside organizations. If you are known, if you're respected, if your name comes up a lot, you will probably be on the first list for promotions, for interesting opportunities, for the kinds of things that would be interesting and beneficial to you. And so, for the past 8 years, I've run an online course and community called Recognized Expert, where I've really sort of focused in on this question of what does it look like? How do you get recognized for your expertise in a thoughtful and professional way? And really, there's three key components to it that are levers that everybody can sort of think about. And I'll also mention I have a free scored self-assessment so that people can actually, take it and see where are you strong, where are you weaker. Anyone who wants to get it can download it at dorieclark.com/toolkit for free. But basically, there's three components. One is content creation. And I'm deliberately using this as an agnostic term. What I mean, basically, is that you need to share your ideas publicly because if you're going to be recognized for your expertise, people have to know what it is. So, if you're trying to build a business, maybe it means you're writing articles for high-profile publications. But even internally, if you work for a company, it just means speaking up more in meetings. It might mean if you have a big win that you share your learnings more broadly so that other people or other teams can replicate it, or maybe you present at a conference or something like that. Number two is your network, because it's really essential. You can't be like the hermit in the cave recognized expert. You need people to know who you are if you're going to be recognized for your expertise. So making an effort to build connections, to get known, be part of the conversation inside your company and inside your industry is important. And the third is social proof. And basically, that's what are the markers of your credibility so that other people can understand really quickly that you know what you're talking about. And that can be anything, if you're self-employed, it might be, hey, I work for these clients that you've heard of, or I have been quoted in these publications that you've heard of. If you work inside a company, it might be, the concept is the same, but the markers are different. It might be that you worked on a project in the company that everybody's like, oh, that was a really good success. That, whoa, you were on that account. That could be a big one. Or it could be having a mentor at your company that everybody's like, oh, she's her protege. Oh, wow. She must be, sort of destined for great things. Or maybe it's being part of, a high potential employee training program, something like that.
You've been on this extraordinary and multifaceted career journey. When you think back to that 14-year-old leaving a small place in a small world and knowing what you know now, if you could go back in time and say something in the ear of that little girl, what would you say?
Oh, I think that I'm not sure really what the message would be per se. I'm not sure there was like a thing that I needed to hear exactly, because I was I was full of a shocking degree of self-confidence, warranted or not. But I do feel good. I do feel good about where I've managed to land. I mean, admittedly, I think I probably thought I would be president by now, and so I'm not there. But I think I've managed to do some cool things. So I'm very grateful for that opportunity.
And you never know what opportunities are going to open up in that space in the next
Well, that's
decade.
exactly right. I am not ruling it out. I mean, Joe Biden is 81, so I got some time here, Gary.
That you do. Dorie, how can people find out more about you and the work that you do?
Thank you so much. Probably the best hub is my website, DorieClark.com. I've got more than 700 free articles on the site that I've written for places like Harvard Business Review that you can download and access for free. And the toolkit that I mentioned, the Recognized Expert self-assessment, is also available for free at DorieClark.com/toolkit.
Thanks so much for sharing. The unlock moment is that flash of remarkable clarity when you suddenly know the right path ahead. For world-leading speaker, coach, and author Dorie Clark, it was discovering that she'd been building skills she wasn't aware of that enabled her to pursue mission without having to fit into a box or rushing to an answer. Find her book, The Long Game, on Amazon and at all good bookstores. Marshall Goldsmith said it brilliantly. If you've ever felt like you don't have enough hours in the day, Dorie will help you strip away the things on your calendar that keep you from spending time on what's most important and achieving your ultimate goals. Dorie, it's been such a pleasure to have you on. Thank you so much for joining me today on The Unlock Moment.
Gary, thank you. This is so great.